Perfect. Thank you, Patricia. And let Patricia know if you can see me well online with the camera. So, and hear us. So thank you so much for having me. And everyone's put in a lot of work, especially we should give a hand of applause to Patricia for organizing such a great group of people. And the scholars here, others that even aren't speaking, I admire the work very much. I kind of feel like a moment has arrived because when I first started studying flexibility and work-life policies, it was not a hot management area. It was not a hot area. And so even the citations, it's like the last 10 years doubling. And finally, the moment has arrived. But it is interesting because there's a lot of ambiguity out there. And so I've organized the talk into 7 themes. I don't believe in death by PowerPoint. The ideas just help me. I've done a lot of reviews. I've been studying these for years. Even my dissertation, I studied human resource innovation. I went to Yale. And my story, I am personal and professional. One was I was a doctoral student there. A famous sociologist, Roosevelt Moss Cantor, was on my committee. And when's the worst time to have a baby in academia? September. And I had 1 class left. And I've been married 3 years. And they said, great, and I had a fellowship. They said, you can have a wonderful on your baby. You can have a reapply for your fellowship next year. And it's very expensive, Connecticut. And so I stayed in, because they didn't even have leaves. Can somebody maybe just put on the volume low? I'm hearing a feedback. We still are struggling with these issues. They didn't even have it for faculty then. And even now, women will come up to me and say, how should I take my leave? Or even men as well. And there are many forms of flexibility. So what I hope you walk away from today is really first starting about what do we know about flexibility, what don't we know. I've done a number of reviews, and I am very practical. Anybody who here works in HR practice? So I've worked in actually HR as well. So I care about questions on practice as well. We'll start with the science, what we know, but a lot of it is implementation, and what the employees think and what the employers think aren't always aligned. And then we'll go into what we don't know as well. All right, let's help it along here. So just start, is the slideshow started? So just hit enter. Why don't we start from the beginning? Now it should work. Here, should I do this? Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So what have we learned about implementing flexibility or flexible working? And I start with a quote here from, and I don't know if we can move up the share so it isn't on the screen there, but basically Microsoft and many companies now have become wildly interested in flexibility even before the pandemic. IBM, for example, and Accenture and all those corporate consulting firms were doing remote working long before the pandemic. It was viewed as a way to be mobile and to adapt a workforce globally to needs. And so it was very interesting how the pandemic has changed our view of this. But this is a 2020 quote from the head of Microsoft for HR. Moving forward, it is our goal to offer as much flexibility as possible to support individual work styles while balancing business needs and ensuring we live our culture. And really, that's the crux of the challenge here. Individual work styles, we need more person-centered approaches to fit all the different diverse needs that employees have. We need to get the business done, and we need to create a culture. And this is sort of all, even before the pandemic, has gone into flex. So I don't know if there's any way to take away the slideshow here. I hope it's not, they can see. But the first theme that we have is that flexibility means different things to different people in different contexts at different points in time. So anyway, we can even go to the other view as well. But people do not necessarily agree on what flexibility means. So I thought we would start out with just talking about some of the challenges and different views on flexibility. I think from an organizational perspective, work-life flexibility, as companies saw during the pandemic, you could get work done. The narrative and the discourse on how flexibility benefited the firm really shifted, like, hey, we get a lot done, where before there was more reluctance. But I think it's been oversimplified in how we link flexibility to the strategy and business processes post-pandemic, and that companies have been better at giving options for people to use to fit their needs, but haven't really thought as much as they should about implementation. And I think one assumption, and this is in the HBR article, is that leaders assume that when employees are permitted flexibility, they automatically have work-life balance. And we all know as academics that have been working, many of us, hybrid for years, you can work from home, but you may not have work-life balance if you're trying to juggle many other things. So this is what flexibility is not: forced teleworking. And I actually was doing some interviews on flexibility, and someone sent me in this picture as how they were struggling with the pandemic. And I don't know if there's any way else to do this. What do you think? And I can also just advance the slides in the slide view.
Press that X.
Oh, close that X.
Yeah.
Yay! Thank you. So this is the cat. So the first thing I thought I'd do, and what is flexibility, is just briefly, and this is in the HBR article, The Future of Flexibility. Let's talk about how companies have changed how they view it over time. It kind of started, and although Rob will also talk about how historically, we work and family were kind of together when people were working on farms, or had people, little shops in the business that were family restaurants and things, and still have that today. But for big companies, it was viewed as a woman's accommodation, as women were entering the labor force in big numbers. And there was a downside of each of these, right? We had the mommy track, a little bit the daddy track, but there was a career stigma to using these. You were viewed as not all in, not committed. So, great you were able to flex, but you're not going to make the C-suite if you're working flexibly at the time. Then we saw during, with the IBMs starting and the Deloittes and the consulting firms, we had kind of boundaryless work. So we had salespeople and consultants working mobilely all over the world. And then in the pandemic, we're like, hey, you could work from home and you could have a meeting at 6 o'clock at night, and we had meetings run into each other, and people were grateful to be able to keep working, but a lot of overwork, working much longer hours, and we saw family problems with our families not really understanding when we were on and when we were off in terms of work-life boundaries. And I did a study for the National Academy of Sciences about women in STEM and how really how departments treated women faculty during the pandemic in terms of at least being sympathetic, and whether they had to hide their family, while they're in a conference call, or one woman had an autistic child having a meltdown, it was created a lot of challenges, and just the department culture mattered in terms of whether people were thinking about occupational turnover. Do I really want to deal with all this? So it really changed our views on the meaning of work. Many people don't have big houses. These are all things that we know, but it makes it challenging in an apartment, right, to be trying to work. And I think, while these how-tos are really important, these really matter, today we'll start with this, what the research has shown, because the research is also scattered, and then go back in our Q&A to the questions. So now we're in the hybrid phase, and I call it the inflexible flexibility phase. And I think there might be a worker mismatch if we say everybody's in on Tuesdays, and we do need to have some coordination, but we still need to be flexible on flexibility. And, there might be that, somebody's parent-teacher conferences on Tuesday can once in a while they miss or call in. We haven't really figured that out yet. And yet, as we know, it's kind of out of control here if workers are what I call the cowboy culture. Oh, I'm in, these hours, but I'm not in these hours. And so what if you have a meeting? There's sort of a two-way street. It's like we're kind of laissez-faire on both employer and employee side, and it's not really working that well. So I think what we really need to do is move and see about how we can make this a market way to help effectiveness, whether you're for-profit, non-profit, but just organizational effectiveness, but also help society and workers. And we haven't had that mix match yet for balanced flexibility. And historically, leaders have not really seen work-life support, particularly flexibility for work-life, as a core part of their supervisory role. It's sort of an add-on. So, first, flexibility means different things. Our narratives have shifted over time. Second thing, common yet inconsistently tested assumptions abound about flexibility, and the body of knowledge is fragmented. So I did a recent review that's coming out, it just came out in Journal of Management, and there's a state of the science measurement gap. So supposedly on paper, flexibility is to help employees have greater discretion to have job control over a role, job characteristics theory. And when you have greater control, it's going to improve your performance, you're going to have greater job satisfaction, it's going to help your recruitment, your commitment, it's going to reduce your work-life stress, is what some of the studies show. Many are cross-sectional, and many are worker self-report. We don't have, like in the sciences, a lot of randomized control trials or control groups. And so one thing I did with this, working with Matt Perugino, who's moving to City University of New York, and Brenda Lauch, a longtime collaborator from Simon Fraser University in Canada, we looked and coded articles for this review and found that nearly 80% of articles said flexibility gives workers control, but then they didn't really measure whether when you use the policy, does that lead to greater control over different aspects of the work role. And so we thought that was interesting. We also have looked at a lot of studies saying that the UN says work-life policies, including flexibility, haven't lived up to their promise. There's a lot of research on backlash and inequity. The idea that we saw during the pandemic, essential workers were not able to flex, and we still have not solved that. We've saw adverse impact on women's careers if they use flexibility more. We saw a lack of access. I wrote a paper with Brenda Lauch in Academy Management Annals on inequality, and that workers at the lowest end of the labor market can't get the type of flex they need. Flex time, for example. Workers in the middle might want to have more variation, work part-time work, but the unions might say we only support full-time work. Workers at the top, or at least professionals, might feel overworked, work-life boundaries. And we need to look at the different industry needs. The business case, Claire Kelleher, who I've worked with, and I know Lillian Dementis, they looked at whether if you used informal flexibility, like your boss says you could work at home next week, or you could leave early to go to the doctor's appointment, does that lead to higher performance versus formally saying, I'm using a policy, and we found that the informal flexibility had greater benefits for organizational performance. That's worrisome if the policies aren't leading to greater performance. And then we need to look at both mixed consequences, right? We all know that working at home can be great. You can have a cup of coffee, you can relax, you can start dinner, but you may have trouble concentrating if you're trying to supervise a child's schoolwork. Same problems in the flexibility literature. The literature is very fragmented, so there's a lot of literature maybe separately on virtual work or remote work, and all this is in the Journal of Management. There's also between micro and macro fields. Psychologists look at things very differently, as we'll hear from our sociologists. Some studies also wouldn't look at whether this linked to the HR system, like how we pay people, how we recruit people, high performance work systems. If you're just looking at work-life flexibility by itself, when it's supposed to be part of your culture and your whole HR strategy, that's a problem. And so there's this idea of bundles. And sometimes when you use one form of flexibility, it gives you a benefit for another. So we know when you work at home, telework, or I know I shouldn't use telework here, it should be home working or remote working, but in US we might say telework a little more. You also might get more schedule control because you shorten your commute, or you might be able to multitask. Not necessarily, but we haven't looked at good and bad combinations. So also working from home, but you have no workload control, that's a bad combination. So there's good and bad flexibility. So Journal Management Lit Review, the idea here was to look at both employer perspectives. We tried to look at whether, we call it like a boundary management and or boundary control and implementation view of flexibility, which is where I think the field needs to go. If you use the policy, does it give greater control over the work role? We're starting with the work role because it's restructuring your work hours. But as you will see later in the review, what people are doing at home has not been studied very well. And home implementation also matters. Then I have a typology here that people have really liked, and I'd love to hear your feedback on thinking about all of these policies holistically, because rather than just looking at the mismatch in studies. And then the big question is, how do you create conditions under which increasing control through using policies duly affects the work productivity and your home and also your societal productivity? We know there are lots of things in society that we haven't figured out, like when schools close. It's all not realigned. So this is another one that's a little screwed up here. I don't know if I should just do this. There you go. I like you to see it. So theme 3, it's fine. Work-life flexibility policies can be defined as a mean to have different forms or types of control over the work role boundary. And here's a definition. It's a lot of words, but the bold are the key ideas. It's voluntary. So I'm not talking about forced gig work or wanting full-time work but only getting part-time work. This is flexibility that the worker wants and that you can control. And we have different types of aspects of the work boundary, and I'll tell you in the next slide what those are. But example might be spatial control, would be control over where you work, whether it's a coffee shop or your home or at the office. It's co-created. So implementation involves not just the user, but that's a lot of what we've studied a little bit on supervisors. We've done very little in team flexibility implementation, family members, and looking in communities as well. And then we haven't really measured well the extent of use, right? How much, a little or a lot? And sometimes you might flex ad hoc during bad weather, when you take your kid for their doctor's appointment, or when you have to go to physical therapy, versus is it ongoing flex? And whether we've used them together or bundled. These are just the basic things we need to measure better. So there's a lot of things here, but you can think now about flexibility. I've added 2 new types. I want you to think broadly. There's a lot on work location, so we collected and coded over 300 some studies, and we had first only done management research, and they had us go back, and we did all the social sciences because we had people that were not from management. So work location control is the ability to control the spatial characteristics of the work role boundary. Workload, which they've done really not as much work as I'd like to see. I've studied reduced load work. The ability to control the size of the work role. Employers have not defined what is full-time work, particularly for professionals, very much. And I was just talking with people about going through the accreditation. It seems like in academia, more and more things are being quantified, added. What is full-time load? And we need to do that for us and to nurses working at the NHS. The ability to control the temporal boundary would be work scheduling. Work-home permeability, I see as part of this continuum. The ability to control the permeability of the work role when you're on for emails and texts. And I have an intervention I can mention briefly for frontline workers that can't take a text at work. That's flexibility too, to know if your kid got off the school bus on time or the doctor calls you during work hours and it's not your break. And then time off and leaves, and I know you have much better policies and legislation. The U.S. individual organizations have it, but it's not nationally paid yet. But having the ability to control continuity of the work role, even if it's intermittent, to take your kid every week to the doctor for asthma treatments. And then bundle approach, the ability to control multiple aspects of the work role at the same time. Where, when, how much you work, and when you're available. All right, the next theme. Large gaps persist in the measurement of policies across domains and levels of analysis and the mixed consequences of use. So let me see if I can do this okay without screwing this up. Yep. So this is basically in the paper in JOM. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It looks scary. Just look at the shades and the unshades. And this is for all the doctoral students or people interested in flexibility or companies that want to partner on research. The white area is what's been well studied. We know a little bit of, and there's still more that can be done, right? You got to, but we know what supervisors think about implementing flexibility. We know that when there's a positive org culture, that helps implementation. What we don't know is how it fits with those other HR systems who, selecting people. Some people probably shouldn't telework because they work better in office. New employees might want more socialization, face-to-face, before they telework. Things like, or homework, excuse me. Work group implementation. We haven't done enough on how work groups work together. So these dark boxes are where there's a lot of opportunity. Similarly, I do think permeability is the new frontier of flexibility when you're on for, connecting to work. Right now, many of us have trouble shutting off our smartphones when we're having dinner with our families or when we're sleeping. And then the other areas we've not really studied well is individual implementation. I know when I'm writing a paper and I can't get an idea, I go check my email. That's not good. So how do you manage boundary preferences? How does it fit with your career? And then this home implementation, there's been so few work studies where we're looking at what's happening at home. I worked with Northern Trust, which has a office in London, and they went to fully remote work. They have a great tool guide. I have an article I could send to you if you're interested in implementation. They had rules like, your phone has to be, or your laptop has to have a function for a phone. You have to have backup system. Those are the technical aspects. But culturally, what they did is they migrated whole work teams to work flexibly, and they had that people commit to work in the office at least a day a week, and at home at least a day a week, and gave some flexibility. That's where we need to go, is work team culture. We've not done so much on as much as we need on these other forms other than temporal schedule control for boundary management, and then really the community and the organization and the work group and the family, how it affects families now has not been well studied. All right, so there are the gaps. Next, because I want to get to our panel, there's only 3 more themes. This is the 5th. Work-life flexibility policies are a rising form of job inequality. So in another review I just did with Isa Villamor, who works for ESA now in Madrid, we find that there's gendered effects, and it could be bad if women are heavier users. I also think it is creating occupational inequality as a basic right, that there are many jobs now as we've come out of the pandemic that we're not including in the flexibility discussion. I did a study for the U.S. Post Office Inspector General on how you can make postal worker jobs more flexible. We need to have some flexibility forms for everyone, things like shift trades, backup rotating people that can go into roles when somebody doesn't show up. We've not spent enough time equalizing flexibility. So here's what another scary slide, but one thing that's cool, and I encourage you with interdisciplinary research, I've worked with Sharon Hill, who does IS work in GW, and actually she's from the UK. We need to define for virtuality, this was the purpose of this review on gender, the idea of dispersion, measuring types of virtuality. Are you working across time and space? And then how you're using technology, your leanness, social media, and how often you're connected. But what we found, the headline is, a lot of the psychologists, and actually were inspired by a review I wrote on gender equality, and they wanted to apply this to this paper, and they had gotten rejected somewhere and asked me to join the paper. The psychologists tend to focus on how helpful flexibility is for person-environment fit, that you can have boundary control, it can adapt for work-life issues for women, and yet some of the sociologists might say stereotyping, it's going to hold back your work. And what we need in studies is to look at the positive and the harmful effects at the same time, and then look at there is good consequences and bad. And the next slide, which is in our headline, tells you a couple of ideas. So what's helpful is that it does allow women, for example, to stay in the workforce if their partner gets moved, and women are more likely to be in dual career marriages. Men are more likely where their partner's job is primary as well or equal. Men might have a spouse that might follow more. It helps reduce social cues for stereotyping. I was just talking with somebody at lunch. I think it was Maria talking about, well, if you're interviewing for a job and you can't see somebody's pregnant in the, Zoom, maybe that would help you. And it gives you access to social networks. Although there is research also coming out of UK that it's a class that some women that are not not in the highest level professional jobs need to get out of the home to create more social networks. So we need to look at different types of women. And then the harmful effects are basically, one is that I think women could be closed off from networks. They're not as mobile. They could get lower pay. They could have more work interference. So once again, we need to look at the career damaging and the career enhancing effects of different flexibility forms. In particular, virtual work could hold women back if they are heavier users and more stigmatized for using it. Briefly, interventions are needed. I do think we need more involving the manager as a linchpin. I've done some work on family supportive supervisor behaviors. Supervisors need to think about how to support non-work roles, but I also don't think we should overload everything on the supervisor. It's the team, it's the individual. But I do think supervisors need training beyond the technical. The cell phone intervention that I looked at in grocery stores and retail, I noticed that many people have to lock up their cell phones if they go to work in retail, and that we were able to have somebody say, hey, an emergency's happened at home, or the doctor can call you. So I did an intervention working to give some control over letting people take a cell phone call if it wasn't their break, and also not bothering people during off hours if you've worked a 60-hour work week. That permeability control is something that I think is very important. The other thing that I think is interesting is I've looked at work-life assessments, whether you're integrator, separator, cycler, and how that fits in your team, working with the Center for Creative Leadership. And I think work teams, I've run these workshops, could look at everybody's preferred style for managing virtual communications. And even people with frontline jobs. I worked with a man at a nursing home whose wife kept texting him at work, and he's like, I want to get out of here. So, so it goes both ways. I think we need to work with families and teams on boundary management styles fitting the arrangement. The last thing I want to say is just the agenda for the future. There's a lot to cover and a lot of implementation problems to solve. So these are just ideas. But I do think we need improving public policy to ensure access is a basic right. I know you have a right to request a flexible work schedule here. I know there's sometimes implementation challenges. Let's keep moving on that. But I would like us to democratize and mainstream work-life flexibility. Marginalized groups and frontline workers, everybody needs to have some work-life support to go to the doctor. Employers need more technical assistance on how to implement it, and workers need protection for worker rights if there is backlash for using flexibility. We know, saw in the States now, Google's and some of these companies that had hired lots of virtual workers, 10% of the workforce got laid off right now, and it was mostly the newer workers and the remote workers. I've got a paper coming out on work-life intersectionality. There are policies that don't fit groups or groups that are already marginalized and stigmatized based on race and gender. If you use these policies, could you be stigmatized more, right? There are certain risks. And I've said also not put everything on the manager. And I'm working now on a paper on sustainable flexibility. How can we link flexibility to business practice and societal gaps and family supports, and not make it a scapegoat when we don't make business results, which is, one article blamed the U.S. Silicon Valley bank failure on flexibility because the CEO was working in Hawaii. Well, maybe that's a problem, but that's not the total reason they failed. So I'm going to turn it over now, and thank you very much.
Okay, so we're going to now move to the panel. So if our panelists would join me at front, I'm just going to stop sharing here. 1 second. I hope everyone can hear us online. We'll move to another device. Okay, so this is just for people in the room. Can everyone hear us online? I hope this is working well. Q&A, 1 second. Yes, we can. Great. Thanks so much. Okay, so the panel. So we are set here. We've got so myself, Ellen, Hee-jung, Maria Adamson, and Rob, and we're going to go through the first 5 questions and then move on to the Q&A. So the first question is for Ellen. Yep. So if you had to summarize very briefly which flexible working practices work and for whom and which do not, what do you say?
I would just say it depends on implementation, and that there is no one best flexibility form, and that I've talked about how different parts of the labor market flexibility may be more important to them. So, workers that are low income can't get flexible hours. If they request days off, they might lose their jobs. They don't have coverage for sick time, absenteeism, you get penalized. And then, so I've already kind of answered this, and I would love to hear more what the panel says, but I do think, schedule control and flex time is probably the one that we know the most about, because there has been more on the idea of schedule control.
Okay, Rob, do you have something to say about this one?
Sure, yeah, thanks. And of course, as Ellen just said, the right answer to most questions is it depends if things work. And I think, as she suggested, there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge about this. And one thing beyond is flexibility good, is it bad? I think what we can start to see in some of the work coming out now is that there are costs and benefits in terms of individuals. So, for example, some forms of flexibility may make you enjoy your job more, but they'll be terrible for your career. Or other kinds of flexibility might be quite good for your kind of home life in some ways, your family life, but terrible for some other aspects of your home life. So I think part of getting beyond the it depends is thinking about the costs and benefits, I think, of probably every kind of flexible working policy.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Secondly, okay, I think you can all hear me, so that's fine. Secondly, we've got a question here for Hee-jung, and it's from the University of Kent, who's in her book is also writing about the extent to which flexible working can be exploitative, and it would be great if you could elaborate on that.
Thanks. Just to let you know, I have these books. I don't want to take them back to Canterbury. It's for anyone who's interested. They're £10 each, which is the cheapest deal you could get. So exploitative. So I mean, it actually kind of draws from what both of you, Rob and Ellen, said. Is that it depends on the arrangement and how you use it, and also one of the things that we tend to forget about. I mean, there's a little bit about the context talk here, but it really depends on the national, cultural, legal, institutional context. And so the reason why I say it is exploitative is because, and Ellen did talk about it a bit, that the boundaries that blur it with time and space with flexible working can make people work not anywhere and any time they want, but all the time and everywhere. And there is this creeping of this expectation of flexible workers to be available all the time, where managers are expecting workers to have a little bit of an early morning, late evening meetings, or expect them to work a bit extra, which you wouldn't have necessarily have done in other circumstances where you had to be in the office and had worked fixed time, where there's also overtime premiums. The other thing that I do mention in the book, which actually, as Ellen said, talks about the pros and cons, because, for example, some of the pros, flexible working, incredibly beneficial for people with care responsibilities. That's childcare responsibilities, which mostly lies on women, but also disabilities and other types of care responsibilities, right? But in our current gender normative, society, flexible working also enables women to do more housework and childcare, which actually entails that they're not only being exploited at work by working longer and harder than they would have otherwise, they're being exploited both at home by not really disrupting the division of household labor and enabling, and again in quotation marks, really women to carry out both paid and unpaid work, stretching their days to the maximum. And it's like, is that exploitative? Me and a lot of feminists say yes, it is.
Yeah, thank you. I think Maria has probably also something to share about this, yeah, from your study.
Do I? Yes. I think it also depends. One would say exploitative, non-exploitative. It depends, obviously, how we define flexible work. So, if we so here the government definition is pretty much everything is flexible work. 0-hour contracts are flexible work. So if that's what we're talking about, then yes, it is quite exploitative. And I agree that it is about sort of something about control here. But also what from sort of my work and our work, and you know, one of my co-authors is here, it's not just exploitative, it can be self-exploitative, where you kind of trying to, and the paper we had about the work-life balance, where we have this idea of how our work-life balance have to be, or you know, how perfect it has to be. And in order to get there, you kind of, even if you don't want the flexibility, you know, you prefer to work in the office, but this is the kind of the current norm, and that tends to apply to kind of highly skilled managerial jobs, where you know the kind of current discourses are moving towards, well, yes, everybody should work flexibly, everybody should have work-life balance, and well, what if you kind of don't want it, or this so kind of one of the things that we kind of think about in this paper is well, how this ideal of you know, balancing everything and being balanced and being flexible can actually drive you nuts. But and the recent project on sort of managers and flexible work also shows that. So we interviewed managers who are parents and who afforded a lot of flexibility to their employees, to do their line reports. However, when it came to affording flexibility to themselves, they were like, oh, no, you know, flexibility, I didn't use any of that, like during, you know, because they didn't feel they could role model that in their current job, which was line managerial jobs. So I think, yes, there's sort of, there's shades of exploitation there, and for exploitation, but it can also be quite beneficial, rightly so. So most of our interviews also said that it was greatly beneficial as well.
Yeah, I think Alan has something to add. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So one of the things in a recent report I saw, it's something called Axios, and it's a news summary thing I read every day. It said that managers now, post-pandemic, about of those that could work virtually, like there's a 20% gap where like there might be like 65% of managers are working remote and their subordinates are not. There's like where many are forced to come into the office. So I think this hierarchy and privilege is sort of interesting to look at. And in terms of, I love the idea about, both of you have talked about exploitation. So we academics are really, I've been working with on a project looking at STEM faculty with Claire Kelleher, comparing the Britain and the US. And Alex, I've talked with a little bit about this as well, and maybe there will be something else we could all work on. But I think universities, the neoliberal university, and I don't know if you've read Peter Fleming's work, we're using this in an article that we've written, that basically we have this idea that we have autonomy, right? And that, you know, you're free, but are we free? You know, we love our work. We can't, you know, get away from our work. So I think this idea that people that love their work, like many of us, you know, working all the time, that may, the STEMification, we're worrying about the STEMification of universities and getting more and more rewards for more publications. And I just taught, you know, now you're international, you got to try, you know, work all the time and now across borders, that might not be so good in the long run, even if you love your work. And but organizations can utilize that for different workforces where their personal identity and their professional identity have high overlap.
Right, thank you. So a couple of questions that we've had before as well. How right are managers? A lot of managers are trying to call their staff back into the office, right? And I know that in the conclusion to your book as well, Hee-Jung, you're also talking about sort of the dilemma of workplaces also being social places, you know, and I think you mentioned something like workers, before the pandemic, workers spent about 40 minutes talking about non-work related issues, and that workplaces actually used to be really social places for us. And of course that a lot of managers are facing the dilemma between calling everyone back to the office and having the sociality again that no one seems to want anymore, and at the same time affording this flexibility. So how can we get around this dilemma? Are managers right to call people back, or what can we do about it?
So you already, Ellen already talked about that a little bit in her talk of many other things, but I think there's that mismatch. So it's like, oh, flexibility is good because it provides work-life balance. It also makes maybe passionate workers exploit themselves even better, which I have to say it could actually end up in really bad results, because that in the longer run may result in low productivity and performance. And there's a whole context issue. I'm not going to go into it right now, but I think there is really good aspects of being together, like here, like we're being together, and we'll see the fruits of that when we do the Q&A. And there's also really great things about doing online. As you can see, there's about 80 now it was 82 people online. And it allows accessibility and I'm pretty sure a lot of those 81 people are not anywhere near London at the moment. So it allows that kind of, and that kind of happens in the organization. But I think one of the things and this is kind of like, and I'm skipping through another question, that during the pandemic, we've noticed that we can actually work from home very well, but we also noticed that we actually really miss our colleagues, and that socializing within the organization is incredibly valuable, not just for just our well-being, but for the organization as well. So smart managers, what they're doing is, they are mandating a certain working in the office day, but they're understanding that day should not look anything like the day that you work from home. That it should be all about socializing, all about brainstorming. So let's get rid of brainstorming long Zoom meetings, but let's do that in the office. But really put into place opportunities. It could be for meetings, just for socializing and getting to know people, even in that physical form. And yes, there is a mismatch in some cases that one day might not fit with the worker, where I need to go see my kids' school play. But with some flexibility, there is that kind of a sweet spot where people can get together really for meaningful things, where you could only do things that can be done in the office, while allowing people to actually go and work from home or work flexible schedules as and when that fits their schedules needs. Take this one. Come on. Okay. Surely someone else has something to say.
Yeah, and I can echo that. In our qualitative research, we heard that in the second wave, sort of almost 2 years post-pandemic, people start saying, well, we've become we have to really think about what drives people back into the workplace, because it's so important. But we don't do kind of the normal sort of, call there or whatever. We do actual work that we really need to do together. Yeah. Brainstorm, we do kind of meetings, we do training, and that also came from concerns around, so obviously our sample was working parents, and it's great for working parents, but also sort of when you come to that stage of sort of, mid-career or senior management, you've already learned your trade. But what about the people kind of coming through the pipeline, and the sort of the onboarding was, I think, mentioned as a sort of significant, knowledge exchange. So that's just, it's the next sort of frontier of implementation. I think, Ellen, and that resonated a lot of how to address that find that balance,
I'm just going to add, and of course, some of those things, they don't have to be done in the workplace. So that's the other interesting thing. I think we assume that physically pulling people together in the workplace will facilitate, say, knowledge sharing or socialisation. Well, it may not. It may be quite a lonely place to be. So I think there are other ways of organising those things that aren't just about the workplace, I think.
I agree 100%. I think, though, anecdotally, organizations haven't really looked at a lot of their business processes to align it. So, example, I had dinner in San Francisco with a recent graduate in HR, and she's working for a very good company, but it was a time when they were going through layoffs. Her boss never came in, and so her job, your first job, after your master's degree is laying off employees. There's nobody there to help you. Your boss is remote working from home. So I do think this idea of the timing, the sequencing. Another example is I know someone who works writing laws for the U.S. Senate. It's a very technical area. Lawyers write these laws. It's nonpartisan. They don't like people, writing like airplane law or how do we get out of the COVID crisis to remote work till they learn how to work with we like working with Parliament. So they really don't let people go fully remote for at least 5 years, but do give people 5 days a month to use either a day a week or all 1 week. So this idea of technical knowledge and not losing knowledge is important. And Patricia told me to go to the Weiwei art.
Weiwei.
Well, so you have to go to this at the Design Museum. He has with China and the industrialization, the idea that knowledge can be lost just as easy as it can be gained, like the idea of art and things. And I think there is a risk of losing knowledge if we aren't figuring out virtually how to pass it on.
Right. I think something that you mentioned in your Harvard Business Review article, but you also mentioned here about the Postal Service, and something that people often ask is, well, you can't do flexibility in all industries. You can only do that really with the kind of, sort of laptop classes. But I remember you were talking about flow tests, for example. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about that, how you've seen this work in other industries.
So I have a paper that writing up on it's 8 unionized workforces, and there was an early paper out of it by Peter Berg that looked at if unions support flexibility, and many of those jobs are hourly jobs, do people value the union more? And the answer is yes. It published in the Industrial Labor Relations Review. And so with that data set, and also working on the National Institute of Health study, I've done a lot of randomized control trials where this side of the room gets flexibility or shift trades, this one doesn't. There needs to be a lot more done with this. There are benefits of having a rotator person because we know that workers aren't going to show up, but we don't cross-train people, so nurses can go on different floors and just hire. It's staffing levels, right? You have to hire knowing that people are going to be absent when there's a strike or schools closed. We know that airlines have boards where you can trade shifts on the airlines. I worked with a study yogurt company where they had guilt-free flex line where you could call in 1-800, can't come in today, but they had that rotator, and they also had ways to have guilt-free flex shift trades, and so you need to get agreement on that. Macy's, I talked with a senior person there, they have something called My Schedule Plus, and this might have updated it now, but when you have a worker working a day before Christmas, 2 days, that's a lot more beneficial to the company than if they're working in the middle of a January storm. So they're trying to make it so people can trade hours to work when customers are in more, and have workers that can't work give to workers to sort of align business needs with these. So you could think of the university, the startup of the term. We need to align business processes more and motivate people while still addressing personal needs. There's still a lot more that can be done on with shift workers, and even the thing I did just work with a police to give a talk. One of the things I'm worried about with compressed work weeks, even though that is the main form that's available to many hourly workers, is I don't know if I want to be operated on or have the 10th hour of a 12, of a 30, the 34th hour of the 36 3-day compressed work week. So I do, and then what we found with some of the police, they're getting second jobs. Right? I talked with Rob like this, we think with students at school. So it's like, what are people doing when they're not flexing? We need to understand better if we make it too easy to not back it up. But I do think, this emergency flex, you can't get in, something's happened with your family, that's natural. Now, how do we get flexibility in our staffing systems?
I think probably we have quite a lot going on in the Q&A. So what I wanted to say, I wanted to have one final question, perhaps, is about bad behavior. So that is first for Rob, but I think it connects all of you because you're all writing about, well, in terms of how we could prevent, how we could prevent it. Well, yes, you were late indeed. However, in terms of how we might prevent it, because probably a lot of managers are worried about, you don't know what is going on in people's houses and what are they doing when they're not messaging me back on Skype or on Teams or on. So that is a question. But also I think a lot of you talked about changing how we measure performance, right? And that ties in and moving from quantity to quality. And I think especially, Maria wrote about this. I mean, all of you written about this. So perhaps first, Rob, about bad behavior. And then moving down the line.
Okay, just check, did you mean bad behaviour of managers or employees at home?
I think probably managers might be worried about employees, and probably every manager has, most managers have managers, so yes, everyone.
Everyone. Everyone's being bad. Okay. Well, I think you're right. I think managers sometimes do wonder what's going on in their field because they can't see people. They're not doing bad stuff. But of course, as we all know, you can be doing bad stuff even when people are watching you. So it's sort of... It's a bit naive, I think, and I think perhaps it speaks to a bit like the question, which maybe we'll come to later as well, about why some CEOs are demanding people go back to the office. I think for managers and others, it's more about giving them a sense of power and control, and I think not being able to, feeling they can't see or feeling they know what's going on, they're assuming the worst, and it probably goes back to things like theory X and theory Y and assumptions about kind of human nature. So I think it's, I think it tells us more about the managers probably than anyone else. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So in our surveys, we've also conducted with managers about how it felt, having workers work from home during the pandemic. And one of the things that came out in more the qualitative is that people who were kind of struggling, or the people who they had struggled managing, they had the same problem at home. But as you say, it's not necessarily working from home that's the issue, but it's that people who managers struggle to motivate or really, get them to work properly, they struggle anyway. But I think you have to kind of turn that question around. It's like, why are they bad? Like, is it because they have too much work? Do they have inept training? Is it, what is it that really makes this worker not perform the way they do? And working from home in itself shouldn't matter at all. And as you say, like, it really has to do with what are some of the targets and what are the key outcomes that you are measuring? And I think the people who are asking people to come back into the office, the managers, really are, and you see a certain demographic say this in particular, is that they do want, like the traditional type of the workplace where they feel powerful because everybody's there and we are all there. And I love how there's a CFO in a financial sector meeting in the US that just came out on CNBC about what she says. Like, look at the managers who are saying, to come back into the office. They're mostly white men with heterosexual relationship with wives at home. The people who did succeed in those workplaces pre-pandemic were those kind of people. And, and they were all sitting at, and then of course, voila, all the CFOs, with the exception of her, were white men. So it's like, and it's like if you're, and we're doing a study about ethnic minorities. Ethnic minority workers generally loved working from home. There's a reason behind it. That tells you a lot about the current workplace. Women loved it. And that really shows you the problematic nature of pre-pandemic workplaces. Now, there are some reasons why we need to go back to some of those elements, sure, but just to say, oh, that's because of productivity is, again, show me the evidence, but you're really telling yourself a big lie.
Yeah, and I think it's a good question to ask, sort of, why are they bad? But I think another interesting question to ask is, why are managers worried? There might be different reasons for that, and different reasons for different levels of managers. So for our managers in our study, so a lot of them weren't worried because they were in touch with their teams and they knew what was going on, and actually virtual work allowed them to understand their teams even more and sort of what was going on, who's doing what. But the pressure came from just unmanageable targets and unmanageable sort of workload that they had to complete. And that's what puts them under pressure and the subordinates under pressure. So we've heard over and over again that when managers were sort of allowed to kind of prioritize, under stress, and that was pandemic data, of course, but this can be applied to high-intensity workplaces where, we stopped, like in academia, we stopped measuring, in a very tayloristic ways, how much time does it take to do stuff? We have workload models which are based on.
Who knows what?
Thank you. But new tasks come in, which and we forget that it's measured, and then it's flexible, and then it's on top of stuff, and then it's on top of stuff, and on top of stuff, and it might be a little thing, but a lot of little things they add up. So so I think when asking sort of why are managers worried about the people not delivering for them that much, I think that question of sort of, well, what are the targets made of, especially in that flexible environment, is very important.
Just have 10 seconds. I was just say also one of the things is people concerned about employee performance, and of course, particularly knowledge work. Performance is notoriously difficult to measure, and a lot of knowledge workers, including many people in this room, spend hours doing pointless things that are somehow important. And I think what a lot of managers are concerned about, particularly that it's, as you say, it's about targets. It's not about performance. And I think this speaks to a more general anxiety managed organisations might have, which is how can we understand if employees are performing well? We just don't know. We know if they're doing stuff, but that's not the same thing. It's irrelevant. Doing stuff is irrelevant. Is it making a difference? And that's what's really hard to answer anyway, particularly hard to answer, I think, in remote working.
Very good. Excellent. Yeah, thanks everyone. So now we're going to move to the Q&A. I will just take a couple of questions in the room and then move to some of the online questions. Any questions in the room? Yeah, Elena. If you say it out loud, I will repeat it here for the one online.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a very exciting conversation. In terms of individual consequences of flexible working and hybrid, I know it's not the same, but it is partially the same. I worry from an equality and inclusion perspective about the, I suppose, certain inequalities getting worse, as you hinted, Ellen. And in particular, one colleague of mine from King's College did a study on the gendered patterns of hybrid work, and some of the findings suggest that basically men seem to be using the back channels like chat functions and so on in meetings, and after debrief chats after meetings a lot more than women, whilst women have this, I know it's a broad generalization, but the attitude was put your head down, do the tasks. And so I worry about it not just from the perspective of we're losing the socializing bit, but as someone who studies politics in the workplace and the importance of politics for a career, that a lot of the developmental and career valuable information happens in informal conversations. And that these hybrid online spaces can potentially just create the same hierarchies of inclusion and exclusion as the in-person organization, right? So I suppose a question to you all is, how do we, have you found something like this in your research, and how do we mitigate for that? How do we create inclusion in the online world, which is quite new to all of us, as it is?
Yeah, so I'm doing this research for the Trade Union Congress, with the Trade Union Congress, about the Black and ethnic minority workers' experiences of home working and flexible working. One of the things that we find in the literature and kind of the qualitative studies is that so that flexible and home working can be really beneficial because you don't have to deal with the microaggressions and racism at work. That's great. But that doesn't resolve it, right? It doesn't at all. And one of the things that the patterns that we see is that all that kind of old boys network, so to say, or the backroom kind of chit-chatting and networking still happens on the online space, but it's just on WhatsApp or some sort of other non-formal routes of communication where, again, women and ethnic minority workers may not benefit as much from or be excluded from. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is worse than the in-office space, with the exception that maybe if everybody was in the office, you could literally see them doing it, whereas in WhatsApp you can't. So I think this really raises an issue of, if there is exclusion happening, that just introducing home working or hybrid working is not going to solve it, and there might be problems of exacerbation, but you need to be able to, again, formalize those routes of communication and network so that those specifically marginalized workers are are at the heart of those networking and training and mentoring and championing opportunities, right? So just by, whoop, we did hybrid working, flexible working, everything is solved. I love kind of what Ellen said, like, oh, flexible working, that's work-life balance. Okay, then checkbox, let's move on. Like, we can't do that. It's like you have to start adapting and all of those problems at the organization. I say in the book, sometimes it even amplifies it. So you need to really be able to change all of those aspects of organizational culture and inclusion, exclusion issues for these kind of policies to work better. Any other questions in the room? Yep, okay.
Thank you for the lovely discussion and the talk. So, Ellen mentioned one thing, that we should not dump most of the things on the supervisor, right? But I'm also thinking, how is the role of HR evolving, and what is the state's role in all this? Because you're working both from the US and the UK scenario. What is the state doing, or is it state actually bothered about all these things which are happening? And I did hear about the union having a conversation and thinking about how to take it forward, but I don't hear anything about the state or the role of HR in that sense. If I look into Dave Ulrich's, all those three-legged stool, how is it transformed after all these things? Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to pass it on to others, but just briefly, I think HR is really important. That they first give the technical aspects of how to set up a good telework arrangement or the rules of, part-time work or whatever. So there is a science, on part-time work, right? You need to not have a full-time job and do part-time work, or we have work intensification. I think you can have, I have an article with Ariane Ollier-Malater, who is French. It's on the, what is it? It's basically the idea that we don't have sustainable jobs anymore. And I think this employee role is to really be conscientious, manage your time well. There are some people that can't handle the cognitive complexity, and I think HR can help with some tips and training. I think managers need help on how to measure performance, and I think teams need help for communication. HR is essential as the intermediate to solve this, but then the legal aspects go into the policy, and whether somebody might not even get hired if they want to work flexibly.
Okay, I think we might be moving to one of the online questions in that case. I think one of the questions here by Laura Kenny. Hello, one of my about 10 years ago. What barriers do you think there are for mandated government interventions? For example, the right to flexible working, and what barriers do you think there are convincing employers to implement flexible working and municipal definitions?
I was speaking on because I'm a welfare state scholar and a sociologist, so I do a lot of kind of policy studies around this. So there's a lot of different types of right to flexible working. So right to flexible working in the Dutch sense is different from what the UK had right to request, which managers would say, oh, thank you, bye-bye, I listen to it. Right to flexible working, the strongest sense is in Finland, where 50% of your time you have to have some sort of determination. And I think this, the problem is that it depends on how much managers are willing to and accepting those types of worker rights. Because at the end of the day, this is about workers' rights on determining when and where their work is being conducted. Obviously, it's the sector and these kind of things are kind of a limitation of all types of flexible working, and Ellen's already spoken about that. But essentially, how much is the government willing to really provide such a strong worker right for that? Managers they have no other opportunities but to actually think about the implementation, whatever that flexibility type could look like. That kind of, I'm sorry to say May 4th there's an election. I don't think this current government is that enthusiastic about such a strong right for workers at this moment. Having said that, one of the exciting things that you do see, post-Brexit in the European Commission level is that there's a lot of kind of push towards flexible working rights trying to be introduced at the European level. The European Directive Work-Life Balance has been introduced, where flexible working is introduced. They're also trying to introduce right to disconnect, which also helps with a lot of the problems that we talked about in terms of boundary blurring, but also, again, providing workers with the right to time and right to their own kind of rest time in these areas of flexible working. But again, this really is, it's more, rather than kind of it being managers or whatever, I think this is a much more of a political thing in terms of, again, trade unions' roles, but also like the government's political kind of ideology in terms of how much, like how much do we need to protect workers' rights around these issues?
And there is an economic reason too. With our aging workforce, we are going to have real problems if we don't have enough caregivers. You know, you want to be Brazil, which was like a pyramid with lots of young people working, and then people in their 60s and 70s at the top. The U.S. and Japan's already there. It's like this, right? With, you know, lots of old people, you know, upside down triangle. And so this is, there's lots of good reasons for labor force participation if it's roles that are positive work experiences. We're underutilizing women, we're underutilizing people with health issues, and we are economically making it so that people do not want to have children or they don't feel supported. So this is, I'm all there on the social, political, this is economic. We can't even get enough people, you know, to be a child caregiver or work in a restaurant. Flexible hours is a way to attract and retain people if there's a more match with people's needs.
Yep, Tessa Wright has a question.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that's why it's like the Finnish government. It's not like they're idiots. There's a reason why they're doing it. There's a reason why the commission's doing it. The commission has very strong kind of ideal that they want to enhance women's employment outcomes, as well as kind of work-life balance, as well as the right to disconnect. That isn't because of just worker rights, but also, you know, at the longer term, it is much more beneficial to give workers rest time and breaks. Otherwise, you will actually have a much less productive workforce. Sorry.
Thank you. We've got about 9 minutes left, and we've got a few questions online that Rob is working his way through. But also, so we're going to have one question from Tessa and see if there's another one in the room. Yep, we've got another one there. And then I think a final one, perhaps. We'll see how we're going at it. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, my question was related to what you were just saying, really, because I was very struck when that report from the 4-day week pilot that's happened in the UK said that actually workers were just as productive, but they were working fewer hours and they were getting the same money. And I thought, well, isn't that a great way to go forward? So I just wondered if you had any kind of comments on that.
Yes. And I think, I mean, I'm sorry, I came from Canterbury, so maybe that's why I could speak a bit longer than others. But so I think one of the things that is exciting about flexible working, and I think Ellen, again, I just wanted to kind of highlight what Ellen already said about how it allows for that control over, and that combination of control over time and space. It's really exciting when we really think about how actually flexible working is used in real life. So when you're in the office, there was a lot of presenteeism and kind of performance of long hours work where you had to go in and had to kind of have your butt sit in front of that computer for how many hours because your manager is, you know, on your neck breathing down. So you really didn't have that kind of control. Where you work from home, we see a lot, and I'm sure you probably had found this as well, that people were working much more flexible hours. A lot of kind of boundary blurring, they were working longer hours, but they were taking long lunch breaks. And many people actually, towards the end of the pandemic, probably could have, were able to kind of, let's say, condense their hours, but not necessarily about condensed like 30 hours in 3 days, but much more like being productive in those hours and having a bit more rest time. And that's what the 4-day week is essentially about, is that we need to detach the ideas of productivity and output with working hours and to just say, what is the unreasonable amount of workload that we can ask for a person full time, and then give them all the freedom in the world to do it whenever and how long they want to. So I think we need to also detach this idea that managers, when you hire a full-time worker, no, you do not own their time 20, it's 40 hours of their time. It's like, no, their commitment is to provide a certain amount of work that can be done. And if they're efficient and can do it in 10 hours, let them do it and let them do something else.
So I agree with that, but I also think frontline jobs, sometimes having somebody there, for security or whatever. So I think we just have to think about fitting the flexibility to the job.
So people are saying, but 4-day week, you can't do it. Let's say, like, for example, what the really core was like social care workers, we work with elderly or disabled, you have to be there. Now, tell me what is the biggest reason of problems, HR problems in social care work? It's attrition and absenteeism. If you have 4-day week, what you see is that you could actually have a much higher well-performing workforce where managers are really suffering from kind of absenteeism and attrition, and you could solve that problem. So essentially, with the 4-day week, maybe that is the flexibility that can be kind of the alternative to home working, because you could actually apply it to everywhere. Like restaurant service workers, we've seen evidence for that. Healthcare workers. Healthcare workers, actually, they're doing a really interesting experiment in Korea, which is the longest hours in the world country, where healthcare workers were really, and the same here, they were leaving in droves. And now with the 4-day week, they are actually being able to not just work, but fewer absenteeism, but also fewer taking kind of emergency leave, because they could fit everything in with work with their other demands.
Okay, I'm going to just take one more question from the online, and then you, and then I think that's probably us done for today. So Tatiana was asking a question for Ellen. Could you talk a little bit more about how that it is really important to explore how not to put everything on the manager, and how would you go about this?
Well, going back to Northern Trust that I worked with in a case study, and it's written up in California Management Review, you have the teams come up with a team contract. And it's something that's flexible. It's a framework. You have people talk about, the coming month, what people's needs are for flexibility. You have to be flexible in flexibility. And I think this idea of core hours, you can do things like during the pandemic, if somebody can't be there, you have team buddies. So I know I can't be there next week, but I'm friends with Megan. Megan's going to let me know what goes on. So you just have to design work a little bit differently, but it shouldn't just be, Mother, may I, yes, you can have Monday off, and then you have to cover. It's got to, we've read about this. We have to look at collective flexibility, and I think we haven't really done a good job of that. And many people are working on multiple projects, and that's the other thing that's hard. So we've all done this where we're working with one team, we need to get something from another team, for another project, they're not there. So then organizations need to figure out how to have these work groups. It's have the integration and differentiation problem that we've had for a long time in organizational theory.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so 2 more questions in the room. Yeah?
Oh, hi. Thanks so much for your inspirational research that you've been doing. We've talked about flexible working, and flexibility brings about the opportunity to bring about transformational change for employers. And one of the things that you've talked about is the role of managers, and they're key in this one. And we've talked about, in some organisations, we have a higher number of men managers. And in some organisations, like in education, for example, whether it's higher education or in schools, tend to be more women. Do you think there is a particular type of skill that's more conducive to bringing about flexible working in those type of organisations?
I'll give this to others, but I haven't always found a gender effect for whether somebody's more communal or agentic in values. So I'm going to pass it on to others to deal with the gender question.
I'm not quite sure what you're trying to get at, whether women are better at giving flexible work than men, or vice versa. Well, our research was qualitative, so we couldn't possibly measure that. But we, in terms of men, and we did study a large group of fathers, well, large for qualitative research, who did feel through the pandemic more enabled both to apply the ability to work flexibly to themselves, but also to others. And that is also, and I think that goes to the question about the policy and the kind of almost like a critical mass. So what we found when the flexible work was embedded in the culture of the organization was almost kind of better able to weather the pandemic. So it wasn't a shock to the system. It was an adjustment, but it wasn't a shock, and it didn't sort of in our sample it didn't come through that sort of it mattered more to male managers or female managers. At least I can't remember that particular instance. But what we did find is that for men and fathers in particular, the ability to experience this kind of continuous working from home and being sort of and given flexible work for a long period of time, but also seeing their peers do that, being able to do that, and their male managers being able to do that, and that's when the kind of the other side of sort of the taking flexible work happened. And we look at the kind of the increased sense of entitlement. So for men to take and to work flexibly, where there was